All right, so I'm going to attempt to explain where I'm at, and I don't like it really because where I've ended up is a place that people end up when truth isn't really on their side, and I don't like something smells funny to me about what my position is at the moment, but I can't figure out where I'm going wrong here, so I'm going to brain dump it, and I hope this doesn't turn into a 2-hour video, and it probably will. And this starts to make me feel a bit like some left wing comedian that has to give an hour of context before they make the joke because the joke isn't reflective of reality in any way. So they have to set this ridiculous bunch of crap up for it to sort of resonate in any way that makes any sense. Whereas if you have truth on your side, then you can hard hit with jokes, that are 3 words in length. And I'm not really able to do that with some sort of clean take home take here. And some of that is just because Bitcoin is ridiculously complicated now. And the trouble is, like, I'm seeing everything from all the perspectives I can find, and they're all basically valid to some extent, but none of them are enough for me to inspire action in any sense. But I basically think where I've come to with what I'd like to see happen in Bitcoin over the next year or two, when it comes to upgrades, is see something like, well, probably see CTV get activated. But I think I'm gonna qualify all that and try and explain my position, and I'll be genuinely curious to see who can watch this and think that I've been reasonable and maybe it's changed their perspective on it. So I'll attempt to go through the various perspectives out there. And this is the thing, I'm going against some wisdom here that I actually think is valid. So you have, like, let's start with the rejection of doing any more soft fork upgrades in Bitcoin. You have Saylor on a podcast maybe 5 months ago saying you only get to play God once, and you only get to upgrade. You only get to you've made perfect money. Now leave it alone. Stop trying to be clever, and you're probably going to do more harm than good. Leave it alone. There's wisdom there, and I think it's correct. I've disagreed with near on everything Saylor has said over the last couple of years, but that I acknowledge as being somewhat valid. There's problems if you do stuff like this. There's hubris and arrogance to adding opcodes to Bitcoin and thinking you've fully reasoned about them and have managed to and have sufficiently justified or managed to dismiss any of the potential side effects from adding it. And we know side effects happen from soft forks. That's what happened with the combo of SegWit and Taproot. I don't know who's more responsible than who else, but SegWit was supposed to fix transaction malleability and give us bidirectional payment channels, aka Lightning, and it did that. But it also gave us cheaper witness data by default mempool policy, which has become just standard. And as a result, you have people taking advantage of that and doing all sorts of things that we demonstrably never wanted in Bitcoin. And now they're here, and it was too controversial to even fix it inside the reference implementation. And that's been a problem. And I'm going to avoid getting into that because anyone that watches this channel has seen me talk about it at length before. But zooming out from that and extrapolating somewhat around what's appropriate to do in Bitcoin and what isn't, then we need to listen to that wisdom even more closely now. Because if we do stuff inside Bitcoin with unintended consequences, there's not going to be a lot we can do to fix it. We know that now, though I'm not giving up defeat in the spam wars. So that said, if I can just start with maybe some advocacy before I continue down the path of the naysayers, we have done something similar to what Covenants or CTV specifically would do in Bitcoin before without any controversy at all. And I guess I can start by just rejecting some of the myths around this stuff. So you have check, lock time, verify, and all that does is it gives you the ability to restrict the spending conditions of coins you might receive to an address, and require that in order to spend my own coins from an address I generated, I must meet an additional condition which stipulates that a certain amount of blocks has passed. So you'll say, okay, I don't want to be able to spend coins from this address for, 1,000 blocks. Then you receive the coins to that address, and when you try and spend them, if it hasn't been 1,000 blocks yet, you can't spend them. If it has, you can, because the condition's been met. So you're placing a restriction on yourself and your own coins that will be enforced by the wider network. Was this remotely controversial? Not to my knowledge, and it's in Bitcoin, and it's part of Lightning, and it's necessary, it's useful, and it doesn't create any problems, and there's no FUD around it. No one is saying, oh, the government's going to hold a gun to everyone's head, make everyone produce check lock time verify addresses that lock up all Bitcoins for 10,000 years, and therefore we'll have no Bitcoin anymore. No one comes out with crap like that around check lock time verify, because it's nonsense. Then you also have additional conditions you can encumber your own UTXOs with, a la multisig, where you can just say, I need an additional signature to sign off on this to be able to spend it. And obviously that's useful, right? You can have a 2 of 3 multisig where you set up 3 hardware wallets because you don't trust any one manufacturer or supply chain, and you require 2 of them at least to be able to sign anything. Again, you're just locking your coins up and placing additional restrictions on how you can spend them, but it's for your own benefit, and it's totally voluntary. But the FUD around it could have just been, government's going to make everyone operate with 2 of 2 multisigs, where the government owns one of the keys, and then they won't sign off on any transaction unless you agree to partake in their whitelist or blacklist. Again, that didn't happen, and there was no FUD around that, and then it didn't need to be because it hasn't happened. At the end of the day, these kinds of coercive techniques, where the rubber meets the road with them is someone comes up to you and points a gun at your head and says, give me your Bitcoins. And restrictions you can place on your own UTXOs are how you prevent that from happening. So if I'm going to get into vaults in a minute, but there is nothing, all it does is it gives you greater control to set your own restrictions, right? It's like, I want to put a lock on the front door of my house. Naively, someone might look at that and say, that's going to make it harder for you to get in your own house. Lock technology is, the government's going to make everyone put locks on their front door that they can't open without the government's permission. That's not the point of locks. The point of locks is to make it harder for people that aren't familiar with your particular setup or don't have the necessary keys to be able to access it. And they work, right? These are not technologies we're using for anyone's benefit but our own. And so this is me starting out dispelling one of the biggest pieces of FUD around covenants, which is governments are going to make everyone encumber their UTXOs and comply with government blacklists and whitelists. It's not a thing. If it was a thing, it would have been a thing with multisig, and it wasn't a thing with multisig. So this FUD needs to die, right? Andreas came out with this a couple of years ago when CTV was being proposed again, along with an activation client that was totally unacceptable. And he sort of said, I'm worried about this. And it's not a legitimate thing, right? I genuinely think I don't have the deepest knowledge about the implications of adding these things, but I'm also not full of shit. So that's quite helpful, I think, in people that are wanting to try and increase their knowledge around what might happen in Bitcoin over the next year or so. So with that out of the way, I'll get into some of the actual benefits and why I like CTV in a little bit. I just wanted to dispel that piece of FUD and talk about conceptually what you're doing when you're creating addresses that restrict the conditions in which you can spend from that address, because that's a useful technology. It's a useful primitive to have inside a tool to have as part of your arsenal. So getting back to the naysayers, right? Because all of the naysaying typically doesn't tend to focus on anything technically about what's going on here, but makes sort of conjecture about the wider implications of adding things in Bitcoin again, and the context of who it is that's proposing them and how it's being proposed. And all of that, I'm going to say, is actually valid. And this is something that annoys the CTVers to no end, because the CTV advocates are like, that's not a technical objection, go away. And I'm saying, well, technical practicalities don't really matter that much. Well, they do, of course, but they're not the only relevant factor. And this is, I'll start with Giacomo Zucco's take on why we wouldn't want opcat, which is another covenant opcode. His point is, once upon a time, we wanted SegWit, and a group of very, very, dislikable, detestable, control freak ego-driven CEOs that are growing too big for their boots, came up with something called the New York Agreement, where we weren't getting SegWit because the miners weren't giving it to us because of a stupid approach we'd taken to activating the thing. And they'd said, all right, we're giving you SegWit and it's going to come like this. It's going to come with bigger blocks and you're going to accept that. And this is the New York Agreement that we're telling you agree with. And this was just unacceptable for a bunch of reasons. We're not going to have development and the entire process of how we do things in Bitcoin be usurped from us by a bunch of arrogant CEOs, even if they're giving us essentially what we ended up with. We have SegWit 2x. We have blocks that are all like 2 megabytes in size, and we have SegWit. That is SegWit 2x, but the way they proposed it was as a hard fork, which, okay, was kind of dead on arrival, but also just it would have set this precedent that you guys have some say over what happens here. You have clout, and they don't, and we needed to establish that by rejecting their approach. And we did that, and this was very important for political reasons. And the point is, SegWit 2x wasn't rejected because having SegWit and having slightly larger blocks was unanimously detested, because we ended up with that. It was the fact that we're not going to be told what to do by you horrible people. And so that's basically the main rejection of OP-CAT at the moment, which is not happening. CAT is not going to happen on Bitcoin. The only upgrade, I think, in this category of upgrades, the Covenants, the Covenants upgrades, that I think is even remotely possible for now is CTV, and that is the one I'm going to focus on in this video. But CAT is an alternative that's being pushed for by people that are openly malicious actors and want to cause as much harm in Bitcoin as possible. Some of it just for marketing, I'm sure, but some of it's also genuine. And I do believe that when people tell you who they are, listen to them. And in this case, they've just given bad advice and said terrible things over and over again and doubled down and never shown any humility or integrity as people. And if they're pushing for a specific upgrade in Bitcoin that I really like, that's going to suck because I'll still object to it based on who's trying to push for it, because I cannot ever have the precedent that these people have any clout or influence in Bitcoin. We need to reject that. So this is a reason that people find kind of difficult to deal with. CTV isn't mired that much or damaged by the reputation of the person pushing for it. Jeremy Rubin is the author of CTV, and he does have some controversy surrounding him for sure. One of the stupidest things he did, I believe, was back when Binance got hacked and CZ said, don't worry, we'll just reorg Bitcoin's blockchain to get back the stolen coins. Jeremy Rubin, while we were all laughing at CK, Jeremy Rubin said, hey, I can help you with this, which was like, excuse me? That was one of the weirdest. That wasn't just a faux pas. That was like, what is this exactly? Is this 5D chess and you're expecting Bitcoiners to know that that's basically impossible, to the point where you're just trying to sort of make some sort of bid for his attention and maybe seek employment from the guy? Is that it? Because I'm not buying that. That just looked like just total unforgivable bootlicking and just apologism for, intervention in scenarios where the person suffering is suffering entirely through their own responsibility, and it's not up to the Bitcoin network to bail them out and undermine its own, the irreversibility and we didn't bail out Mt. Gox people by screwing around with the blockchain. You just don't do that. And we wouldn't even attempt to, right? And this was a nice line in the sand we drew between us and, the DAO hard fork in Ethereum, where they're like, oops, a smart contract went wrong. We need to fork the entire network to fix that. We could have easily just tried to make justification for doing that in Bitcoin. And actually, some people did request forking Bitcoin to undo the Mt. Gox hack, but it never got off the ground because that would violate the principles of Bitcoin, right? So, that's an important area for us to maintain some sort of self-respect and, being able to hold our head high and say we do the right thing. Like, even if it's painful, we're not going to undermine or sabotage our own principles. So that was one really weird thing he did. And there was something else he did that I don't know, I haven't confirmed, but I didn't like it, but I haven't really confirmed he did it. So I don't want to just sit here and spread rumors. And the one other thing was just presenting CTV with this activation client that was, again, BIP9 with lot speedy trial, all this crap that like we're never ever going to do again because it's infuriating. Back in the Taproot activation days, Core was still bike shedding when Luke and I and Shinobi released the CTV, the Taproot activation client, and that was a hard client. It said lot true and it said BIP8, and it used BIP8 instead of BIP9. And right after that, Core finally released their activation client too, and we kind of fit together, and the miners activated Taproot, regardless of if you think they were forced to or if it was voluntary. Kind of hard to know. Back then, I was unknown until that thing happened, and then suddenly I saw the IRC chat the day after we released it, where everyone was going, "Who's this mechanic guy?" And someone sent me a meme of me in GTA with 5 stars of police wanting me and stuff like. And this is sort of set the precedent for how things go with Core. Like they never ever do proper activation for stuff like that. But I'll get more into activation of CTV later. I don't want to get sidetracked with that. I'm just talking about the author and the champion of CTV. So in this case, I genuinely thought my feeling for a few years has been CTV is probably pretty good, and it's being hurt by the author of it advocating for it. He needs to kind of step away. If the thing's going to end up in Bitcoin, it will, and he probably just needs to get out of its way now because there's enough people championing it without him needing to be a part of it, and him being a part of it is probably prohibitive to it. So I advised him as such, and then it sort of circled back a year later, and people really started pushing for it, and I think that was good advice because amazingly, I think he actually listened to me and followed it. So all that is Giacomo's objection, and his objection isn't to CTV there; it's to CAT. But it's a good point, and it does. But it's a temporary thing, is the point, because after a little while, the reputational taint can go away and it can come back based on its own technical merits. So it's not a permanent thing. Then you have the objection of the Blockstream people who want more sophisticated stuff than CTV. They want simplicity. Adam Back is really keen on drive chain, which is just never going to happen. And I also really, really strongly dislike Paul Stork, a lot more than I could ever dislike Jeremy Rubin. He's advocated for 51% attacking drive chain into Bitcoin. And this is just, this is absolutely disgraceful. And go and look at the arguments for BIP 300 and BIP 301, which is what drive chain is, a combination of those two things. And look at the rationalizations the guy points out. They're all complete straw men nonsense that are very easy to debunk. Stupid things like, if we don't add this, a shitcoin will add it, and when they do, Bitcoin will lose market share to that. This is absolute FUD. Like, you don't need to add features to Bitcoin to stop a scam coin overtaking it. This is nonsense FUD, and it's been thrown at us forever. And it's not there's truth in it, but it's not an unequivocal. If you don't keep adding features, Bitcoin will lose to a chain that's prepared to keep adding features. There's trade-offs there. You can't act like that's just unequivocally one direction. Like, Bitcoin is the lack of features, right? And this bleeds into the final point I want to talk about, or the final argument, rather. I'm nowhere near the final point I want to talk about. This video, as I said, is going to go on forever. The final perspective is Jimmy Song's, and he did a debate in Lugano against Jameson Lopp, and he just made fantastic points where he's saying you're looking at Bitcoin as a technology. You need to look at it as money, and money works when it doesn't keep changing all the time. And this sounds like a crude argument, but again, the wisdom there is undeniable. It doesn't speak to the specifics of any particular upgrade, but he's saying that, well, there is a technical reason for what he's saying as well, which I find really compelling. But the more like high-level philosophical argument is just money just needs to be inert and unchanging and unconsumable. And the more it's like that, the more it's like money in general. So, but I mean, on a technical level, his point is valid too. And he's used Lightning as an example, where he says the minute you added Taproot, you changed the way Lightning worked, because now Lightning would work using Taproot addresses instead of just SegWit v0 addresses. And that rug pulls everyone in the space because all of the people that are trying to work with what we've got at the moment know that there's an upgrade coming. So they abandon what they're doing at the moment and wait for that. If you keep changing the foundation of a house, the guy that needs to work on the first floor and the second floor and the third floor, I'm starting with first floor in the English sense, the ground floor would be on top of the foundation. The point is, those guys will never start working because they know the foundation guys are coming back and moving something in the end. And this is a very apt analogy because people need to build stuff on Bitcoin. And if you could say to everyone, we are never doing another upgrade in Bitcoin again, no more soft forks, period. You know what that does? It pisses off a lot of developers that want to play with fancy new toys, but it also gives other developers, quieter guys that want to build in private and build with lower time preference, the security they need to know they're not wasting their time. Because if you build on Bitcoin and we keep adding new opcodes and new ways to do things, that's extremely frustrating for people that are putting in the time and effort to build these wonderful things we're trying to get into Bitcoin with the tools we already have available to us, because we keep rug pulling them by changing stuff. And this is such an important point, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what tools we have available to us if the applications to use them aren't being built and people just aren't motivated to do it. And if we keep changing stuff on them, then that's infuriating. So don't do it. And but I mean, he tends to make the argument more based on philosophical arguments about what is money than about this specifically. But he does make that argument, and I find it the most compelling out of all of them. Then there's one left, I should say. That was supposed to be my final, point from the naysayers. And I encourage you to watch that debate between Jimmy Song and Jameson Lopp in Lugano Plan B. You should just be able to look for those words on YouTube, and you'll be able to see it. It's a fantastic debate, and Jameson Lopp gets his ass handed to him as he should, because he's not making, it's the counterpoint, I guess, that he makes is that sometimes you need to move to stand still or to stay where you are. But that's a valid point, but it's just it's a very shallow perspective to have on what's going on here. But I mean, that comes down into the weeds of this false dichotomy between ossification of Bitcoin, as some would advocate, but everyone has a different line. There is never going to be complete, stagnant nothing in Bitcoin ever. There always has to be janitorial work and housekeeping that must go on. But there's somewhere you draw the line between that and adding new opcodes with soft forks. Somewhere between those is the line, and we're all trying to figure out where that is. But ossification is a non-starter. You can't just never touch Bitcoin again and say it's fine now, because that's obviously not going to work. It has to move somewhat. So Lopp is right that you need to move to stay where you are, but adding new opcodes to do stuff like that, to try and appease a changing environment. Here is the point there's like several points I want to make in this video that I hope permeate the whole video. And the one that I made is, this fear around governments coercing people to use, covenant encumbered addresses is not a reason to reject the whole concept. But the other one is this notion that the people trying to push covenants on us aggressively keep overstating the use case and the potential for what actually might happen. The potential, okay, they're being valid with that, but the expectation is ridiculous, and they need to stop making the example I'm going to use is Reardon Cole going on Stefan Lavara's podcast and saying, we have 8 billion people, we have this much on-chain requirement, or this much block space requirement, if each of them is to open one Lightning channel a year. And if they are, napkin math, saying this is, if we want people controlling their own UTXOs, and if we want people using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange with this much use and extrapolate with that many people in the world, then we can't do it, because there are 4 orders of magnitude too many people or something like that. Hence, we need covenants because we need UTXO sharing, and I'm going to get into the features of it soon. And here's the point that I want to use to push back on all this. The reason people are not using Bitcoin in a sovereign capacity, either to store it or as a medium of exchange, is not because we don't have the relevant technology yet, because the relevant technology only helps us do those things in an environment much worse than the current environment. Right now, we have an environment where block space is still super cheap. So if you want, you can use Bitcoin on the base layer, do several transactions a month without really spending much at all, with the simplicity of just layer one, right? You don't need to use Lightning. You don't need to do any channel management or any of that stuff. You've got 6 sats per byte. I'm looking at the blockchain right now. Granted, it's Sunday night, so that's going to be some of the cheapest times around, but that's still so cheap, right? And you can use that to open a Lightning channel and do hundreds of transactions there if you want. And people still aren't doing it. So adding a bunch of covenants saves us in a scenario where everyone at the moment that was using Bitcoin was using it in a completely sovereign capacity, but it gets too expensive to do it. So we have UTXO sharing, coin pools, channel factories. We have all that stuff that brings us back to today where suddenly everyone was using Bitcoin in a sovereign capacity, except they're not doing that. So you have to acknowledge the fact that it's not a technical limitation in Bitcoin that prevents people from being sovereign when it comes to their UTXOs. It is a willingness issue. People just actually don't want to do it. People want to leave coins with third-party custodians, and they will get wrecked over and over again for doing it, but they will not learn. That's just a fact. And if you pretend that people are motivated to do it, but there's a technological barrier that doesn't exist, then you're trying to create motivation and hype to add something based on false premises. Does that mean I don't want covenants? No, because I'm basically going to say we should add CTV in this video. But I'm saying doing it off the premise of the fact that that's the only way we'll have sovereign usage of Bitcoin is bullshit, because we don't have that now, and the environment is perfectly conducive to it now. So it's a people problem. It's not a technological problem. I find that really important to make, though I admit that means it's like adding check lock time verify. You can't tell people like, we have to add this thing. It's critical for the future of Bitcoin. It's like a boring upgrade. It's one of many upgrades that needed to happen to allow Lightning. And it happened, and it was non-controversial. That's basically what we're hoping to do, what sensible people might be using to advocate for covenants here. I understand that, you do need to generate some hype, and using this napkin math number around like 8 billion people all trying to use Bitcoin in a sovereign way. I get it. But this is the thing. I'm not even going to get too much into the problem that they're trying to solve, because it's demonstrably terrible, and I've gone into it in other videos before. It's Whitney Webb doomerism style stuff where you're just saying, if most people can't afford to use the blockchain, everyone's going to use third-party custodians. No one's going to be able to run a node. It will be a permissioned network. It will be a walled garden. It will be email all over again, because even if you can use it in a sovereign capacity, the fact that no one else does means you're just going to suffer for being outside of the walled garden. So if you want to use email sovereign way, hats off to you, but none of your emails are going to make it inside the walled garden. You need to be allowed by Google or by Hotmail or by Apple or one of the big data people that gatekeeps the whole protocol if you want to be able to use it. That can happen with Bitcoin too. And by that, I just mean everyone else is using permissioned Bitcoin, and you can't come in with your unpermissioned UTXOs and expect it to work, because the economy just isn't geared that way. That can happen in Bitcoin, and that is the future that the Covenants bros are trying to impress upon us as being terrible, and implying that the thing becomes completely captured like every other internet protocol. And they're right, but they're just presenting covenants as a solution when they're just being unrealistic about whether that actually will manifest that way. It won't. Lightning was supposed to be a way for us to do things that it wasn't ever going to turn out to do, right? Lightning is just, I love Lightning. I supported everything about it. I wanted to, I want to add L-Enhance, which is, I don't really want to add that. I want to start with CTV, and then we can go from there. I don't think L-Enhance is going to get the same kind of support. But I'm going to get into the specific benefits of CTV soon. But just talking about that a little more, they are right about the disaster scenario, but they are wrong about covenants somehow fixing it, because again, covenants solve a problem that doesn't exist yet. And once that problem exists, solving it is only going to get us back to what we have today, which is still not good enough. There are people that just aren't using Bitcoin in a way that is independent of third parties. And that's just a fact. And it doesn't matter if you add more tech to the stack. It's not going to fix that. It's a willingness problem. And if you can't keep slapping people over the head with exchanges going bankrupt, Mt. Gox, Quadriga, BlockFi, all the others, Bitfinex and Bitstamp getting hacked to pieces as well, but surviving. If that isn't enough to make people go, oh my goodness, I need to store my own coins, then nothing will. Adding CTV is not going to suddenly make them go, yay, now I can finally self-custody everything and have complete permissionless usage of Bitcoin and unilateral exit from a coin pool. None of that is going to work that way, right? Because we know people just aren't prepared to do it. So those are the naysaying sides of it, and that's pretty much the whole group of people that are pushing back against it, with one exception, which is basically my camp, which is this spontaneous movement of monetary maximalists that came around when Ocean launched. And I mean, I don't want to claim too much credit for that. It's possible this existed in a nation sense before Ocean. But when Ocean launched and it was like anti-spam and people were like, what do you mean? This is censorship. And we're like, no, Bitcoin's for monetary transactions. Anything else, any other use case is an abuse case. And we've always made efforts, like your node is a reflection of the fact that all we've done in Bitcoin for years is try and mitigate arbitrary data storage and, extraneous use cases because it's bad for Bitcoin. Like, people have said that for a long time, and the monetary maximalist movement within Bitcoin was born, and it makes effort to try and make life as difficult as possible for people trying to use Bitcoin's blockchain for arbitrary data storage, because that's not what it's designed for, and it's degrading to the whole network. I've gone into this in other videos. That's not what this video is about. I'm very much in that camp. These people have several points, and they are generally against CTV, and I'm kind of out of alignment with them on that because I think I'm pro CTV, but I'm going to lay it out in its entirety in this video. So they have a few points there. One of them is we're still reeling from the ill effects of the last upgrades, and if we can't fix those, what hope in hell do we have of fixing any side effects from anything else we add? I think that's a valid argument. It's kind of based on, again, pretty non-technical heuristics. And when you look at what CTV is and you compare it to innocuous things like multisig and check lock time verify, it's pretty unconcerning adding something like CTV. I don't think there's a way you can leverage it to start having the tail wag the dog and, pervert the incentives and turn everything upside down. I don't think you have something like that. But again, I wouldn't pretend to know. And I think that I'm not going to be hubristic. I'm going to admit that I haven't fully reasoned about these things, and neither has anyone else, by the way. But anyone it comes down to a dice roll. I think it's probably okay, and that's why I'm hesitant to sit here and go, let's add CTV, let's go, woo, and start championing it, because I know that unintended things happen, and I want to be cautious in how we proceed here, but I also know that you can't just never ever touch it, because you have to actually, from time to time, you have to be brave and you have to push forward, and occasionally you'll break things doing that. But the other option isn't. It's like I used to fear getting older until I considered the alternative. I don't want to imply Bitcoin dies without this stuff because that's too extreme. But I think a lot of the doomsday scenarios people envision for Bitcoin are basically going to happen no matter what we do. But I don't think that means we stop trying to do certain new interesting things either. And I certainly do love some of the features. But again, I keep trying to talk about the features, and I don't want to come to them yet until I've laid out all the positions of the naysayers, because the naysayers are never about the specific features offered. They're always about, what about this, what about that, and unintended consequences. So the monetary maximalists are saying, what about unintended consequences? We can't wipe our own ass. We can't fix the things that have happened from SegWit and Taproot. They're right about that, but SegWit and Taproot are much more significant things than a Covenant's upgrade. So I'm not particularly worried about unintended consequences from that. Again, though, just to caveat it, I don't think that's. I'm not going to sit there and say it's fine. CTV is fine. You're an idiot. You're a Luddite, etc. As these overly enthusiastic supporters like to say. I think that's arrogant. I think there can always be unintended consequences, and that's one position the monetary maximalists take. The other is How does this increase Bitcoin's use as money? It actually does, because it definitely increases the economic density of what you can do with, you can use your on-chain footprint to represent more economic activity. That's true of Lightning, and it's true of Covenants as well. So I think that's fair. I think that's an answer to a reasonable question they have there, not so much something they're using to push back on Covenants with, but they're just demanding an answer to that, and I think one exists, and I think I just gave it. And the other is just, they also kind of overlap with Giacomo there when they're just saying, they're using a social political heuristic again, and they're saying, I don't like the people that are pushing for this. And Grubel's used that too, and that goes back to that I should have made that point when I was talking about the Blockstream guys. They're saying the people that are pushing for Covenants upgrades have done nothing but antagonize and insult who they call the derogatory label for people that are trying to make the spam filters work again, calling them filter boys and other derogatory labels of that nature, and just trying to mock any effort to that effect. Saying you care suddenly about 8 billion people being able to have affordable access to Bitcoin as a medium of exchange without needing a trusted third party, the credibility of that claim is laughable if you're watching 90% of the block space be used for JPEG storage, and you're mocking any attempt to try and fix it with the low-hanging fruit, which is just making the spam filters work properly. That shows a disingenuousness about the actual concern for people being able to use it. And again, if you have Covenant upgrades or any upgrade in Bitcoin, and you have 1,000 developers that want to build shitcoins on top of Bitcoin, and you have 3 developers that want to build a new type of wallet that makes shared UTXOs with minimal interactivity and improves Lightning and all that, it's not going to go well for us, is it? Because most of the people are motivated by something other than that. So when it comes to the Taproot Wizards and the Sandwich Heads, the fact that all of them relentlessly mock people that actually want to do something to prevent spam clogging up the chain today with low-hanging fruit to do it tells me that we're not going to get any of the tech that enables more cheap, more sovereign access to the base layer, because none of the people advocating for the tech that supposedly allows for it seem to actually be interested in that. So that's a very important point. Again, it's not a technical rejection of any of the Covenant's proposals, but it speaks to the communities that are pushing for these things, and that ultimately speaks to the tech that will be developed on top of them. When the Taproot Wizards want an opcode and they tell me it's to feed the homeless, I'm like, well, here's what you guys have been doing, and it wasn't feeding the homeless. It was scamming people with pictures of cats. So I'm not going to give you what you want, no matter what the rationale is that you present to me for it, because you obviously want it for some other reason that you're not stupid enough to just be candid about. So that's why, and it's ironic really and tragic, because the monetary maximalists and the people pushing for Covenants, if we take the people pushing for Covenants at their word and ignore the inconsistency in their motivation and just say, you guys want to increase Bitcoin's moneyness, you want to make it easier for poor people to have sovereign access to Bitcoin as a store of value and as a medium of exchange, that's in complete alignment with the monetary maximalist. It made no sense that these people disliked each other. But one group, the two different approaches betrayed the seriousness of both of them. But I do know people that overlap both camps, and I am one of them, which is a difficult spot to be in for me politically. I'll be very honest about that, because in my capacity that I work for Ocean, I had to become the mouthpiece, for this particular approach that was alien to so many Bitcoiners, even though the nodes they'd been running had been treating arbitrary data with hostility for 10, 15 years, right? It puts me in an awkward position, but I'm endeavoring to be as truthful as I possibly can be, and uncomfortably laying it out, even the things I haven't really figured out yet. I'm trying to put it all out there in an effort to actually get this conversation to a place of maximum integrity where everyone really is operating with as much knowledge as possible. And I know this is mired in politics and reputation and all that stuff, but I'm just going to be honest with you guys about where I'm at with it. I genuinely think CTV is a pretty good idea at this point. And I'm just going to round off the monetary maximalist position that is typically against CTV, even though I'm a significant member of that contingent within Bitcoin. And it's not my position. I'm just trying to steel man it. I think the suspicion the monetary maximalists have of the people pushing for CTV is warranted. But again, I don't think any of them would claim that it's a technical refutation, because it isn't. It's based on other heuristics which are important, and there is wisdom behind them. But at the same time, you have to know when to abandon those. They're not principles, they're heuristics, right? So you have to know when those are not applicable. And I think in this case, they're not applicable, because this is too reminiscent of, of just trivial upgrades we've added before, like multisig and like check log time verify. So with all that rounds off probably the first third of the video. Now I transition into the second third, where I can talk about some of what CTV actually does and how uninspiring a lot of it is, but how it's all just kind of interesting. And it's not going to mean 8 billion people suddenly have access to Bitcoin as a permissionless store of value and as a medium of exchange. It's not going to mean that, but it's still going to be better than it is today, with probably no side effects. Assuming you're okay with upgrades, I mean, there's going to be a lot of implications when it comes to activation. And I think if I can do the third act of this video, it's going to be on activation here. So for the 3 people that actually make it to the end, enjoy the structure I have managed to conjure up for this impromptu. So vaults. Let's talk about vaults, because I actually really like this concept. So Op Vault itself, which is not CTV, right? It's just trying to do that one specific element of it, or CTV is trying to emulate one element of what vaults offer. Either way, they're both covenants, right? The concept basically with a vault is I create a Bitcoin address that has, that can only spend to another address that has a one of two script condition imposed on it that allows for certain very useful behavior that can save me when I'm under duress. So the way it kind of works like this is I create the vault, which is just a Bitcoin address. I send some Bitcoin into it, and I can only spend Bitcoin from that address to a time-locked... The vault is address A. I can only spend from address A to address B, which is predefined when creating address A. And when I spend to address B, that's time-locked, and I can't then spend on from there unless a certain amount of blocks have passed. So if someone comes to my house, holds a gun to my head, and they say, spend the coins, and I say, sorry, it's a vault. I can only spend them to this address, which is already encumbered with a time lock, and you're going to have to wait for that time lock to expire before you actually have the money. But if you don't wait, I invoke the emergency, escape code or whatever it is. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Let me pull up the link here. So, there's a pre-specified recovery path, and that is available. That's the other spending condition of the script that's there at the drop of a hat. And that can be an address you create that is a 10 of 10 multi-sig with one wallet in every single continent, with an armed guard standing, protecting each private key or something insane like that you never want to use in day-to-day circumstances, but you can trigger your coins going there if you're under duress. And if the attacker comes to you and they're saying, right, I have to wait around a week for you not to invoke that emergency recovery, which it just increases the scope of what an attacker must do, whilst meaning that you can continually, peel off chunks of your money from your vault and then waiting 1,000 blocks or however many blocks it is you decide must, be the coins you're pulling out of the vault must sit in this limbo for where you're allowed to invoke the emergency recovery script. So to summarize all that, you just peel off some coins from the vault, put it in a second address. That second address is time locked, and it allows you, if you're under duress, to cancel that and send everything to an emergency recovery. Ideally, you never want to send everything to an emergency recovery because it's by design almost impossible to spend those coins, and the attacker is going to have to follow you around the planet, flying from continent to continent with a gun to your head the whole time to get it. They're not going to be able to get it. And if you're smart, you keep 1 or 2 Bitcoins or whatever in some little stash that you say, you could just have this. Like I keep that for attackers if you want, and then they can disappear with $100,000 or $200,000 maybe, and they just have to be happy with that because they don't have the scope to follow you around the planet trying to get your emergency recovery stuff. So that's basically like the concept for a vault, as far as I understand it. I might have some of the minutiae wrong there, but you can't do stuff that's sophisticated at the moment. You can only do time locks at the moment, and they're not so good, right? Because an attacker can just come to you, say, "Hey, I want your money," and you send it all to a time locked address, and they say, "All right, give me the private key for the address once it becomes spendable. I'm just going to outbid you." So if you have 10,000 bitcoins and you sent them all to, this time locked address, give me the private key for that. And the minute the time lock expires, I'm going to outbid you in the blockchain. I'm going to put 9,000 bitcoins as a transaction fee and pay myself 1,000. So you can either outbid me and wipe out your whole stash in a transaction fee, or you can just let me have the money in the first place. Either way, you're losing your stash because they don't care, right? They can outbid you 99% of what there is available. They can just use as a transaction fee, and they will just outbid you. So at that point, the time lock is not a time lock is not sufficient tech for you to create additional security for your coins. Not really. It adds an extra hoop an attacker has to go through, but it's not one where they have to sit there with a gun to your head the whole time. They just come and say, "Give me the private key," and then you never see them again. And then you wait for a year or however long your time lock is, and then you get in a bidding war with them, which they inevitably win. Or either way, you lose. They can lose too, or just you lose. They either get the whole stash, or you outbid each other, outbid until the entire thing is just the only one that wins really in that case is the miner that picks up the transaction fee. And we've seen that before, actually. Some of the fat finger transaction fees in Bitcoin are that exact scenario where someone has a private key that shouldn't have that private key, and they immediately spend the UTXO, and they use 83 Bitcoins as a transaction fee because they just want to outbid the person who actually owns it. They don't care if they lose half of it's a transaction fee. They just want what money they can get from it. And if they do a normal transaction fee and the rightful owner notices, then they're just going to get in a bidding war, and it's a 50-50 chance who wins. So better to just go ridiculously hard. Wait 9 minutes since the last block. Not that actually works that way. And then steal the 200 Bitcoin UTXO and pay an 83 Bitcoin transaction fee. You're going to get in the chain, and everyone's going to go, "What the heck was that?" But I mean, I digress. That is, CTV permits some of that. I don't know to what extent it does. Opvault is disliked because it basically is designed with the partnering of the Op-Unvault covenant, where it's efficiently designed so that you can keep adding more and more UTXOs to the vault, and when you unvault everything, you can do it all in one go, which is super efficient, but it encourages address reuse, and address reuse is possible in Bitcoin, but it's a bug. It's not intended behavior, and there's a reason for that. Every time you pay from an address, you reveal more of what an attacker would need to actually extract a private key. And in the past, there have been instances where, depending on how the wallet is created that constructs the transactions for you, there have been people that have spent from the same address 4 times, and that was enough for an attacker to go, I can figure out the private key from that, and then steal everything from that address. Granted, that is an absolutely retarded wallet that shouldn't work that way, but nonetheless, that's a thing. So address reuse kind of makes Opvault a non-starter. But nonetheless, all the other things I was talking about there, I really like it. So if there's another way around that, or you're just prepared to make a unique vault for each transaction, that could be possible too. And that doesn't commit that faux pas. Address reuse is worse than a faux pas, but maybe there's some thinking to be had there. But also, Opvault doesn't have consensus. Barely anyone talks about it. I don't know anyone apart from NVK that is a fan of it. And I like it. But again, it has that issue. CTV does offer some of that functionality. I don't know where the overlaps lie and where the dead spots are. But maybe it mitigates the address reuse issue. If it does, that would make it pretty much strictly better. But again, I don't know. I'm not exhaustive in my knowledge of this stuff at all. I'm still a newbie. If you want to get into the technical weeds, plug for a video like 7 videos back on this channel where I get into just the technical stuff of covenants. I really struggle to understand it, but it's with Moonsettler, and he has a really good understanding of it. He really understands, how to read a spec and reason about all the things it can and cannot do. And he's one of the ones pushing for just going rogue and activating L enhance at the moment. But again, that's Act 3 of this video where I talk about activation. So back to the benefits of CTV. The next one is scaling via UTXO sharing or payment pools. So this is the fun part, right? You can have relatively non-interactive, collaboration between people within a single UTXO where money can move around within it. And as a result of that, the result of it not taking up as much space as it would on the chain if it was all just people using, a UTXO belonging to a single entity. Well, I mean, I guess that's not strictly true because multisig exists. I don't know how some people will just write off CTV as like, I can already do that with multisig. I don't think that's fair. UTXO sharing and coin pools certainly seem like a cool thing. And I'm kind of having a hard time. I'm drawing a blank here on explaining what it does. Because, I mean, I really don't want to start talking about Arc, which, I mean, covenantless Arc exists. But the Arc that got everyone really excited required CTV, but it also required CSFS, which, again, doesn't have consensus. But Arc is, it has a minimal on-chain footprint, and it allows people to do a lot of economic activity without touching the chain too much. And it allows unilateral exit. So all that does sound great for scaling Bitcoin. Again, going back to that overarching thread of this video where I say, is that going to manifest in people doing a bunch of sovereign Bitcoin usage? It's not, because they can do it now and they're still not. So again, the technological breakthrough that allows people to do what is already possible and that they're not doing is not going to suddenly mean that people start doing it. And that's, again, I'll make that point. But does that make payment pools any less cool? No, I think payment pools are good, and they're something that, if they're in Bitcoin, is strictly better than if they're not. And are there any side effects to having them? Not that I know of. So again, kind of cool. Let's add it. But and did I explain what they do very well? No, not at all. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on that. But I think. I don't think there's side effects, and I think they're strictly good to have. So again, it's not particularly exciting, right? I don't need to sit here and tell you that 8 billion people are going to suddenly have sovereign access to Bitcoin because of that. Because that's a massive exaggeration and it's just not accurate. But it doesn't mean it's not cool. So maybe we should add it. So I'll definitely advocate for that. I'll read you the summary of what payment pools do, given that I'm failing so hard to sort of give an explanation for it. So with CTV, you could construct a payment condition wherein multiple parties share the same UTXOs. Through this method, a party or parties could consolidate a handful of transactions into a single UTXO and place CTV-enforced restrictions on how much BTC from the UTXO can be spent to certain wallets. For example, a shared UTXO for 1 Bitcoin could be split into 5 payments of 0.2 Bitcoins to 5 different wallets. When it comes time to distribute payments, the UTXO is broken up into multiple payments, and each party receives their allotted share. This feature enables payment pools that have ramifications for exchanges, mining pools, and CoinJoin services. Yeah, and certainly CTV would have been a useful thing for Ocean to have, because there's always that one address in every block we find where we just have to pay everyone that was below the threshold or couldn't fit inside the Coinbase transaction because we're limited with how much space we have with that. It's getting better, actually, because Bitmain released some updates. But the point is, Ocean has to pay itself a bunch of money that we wish that does belong to miners ultimately. And we can use CTV to define that, to predefine it. So that one address that gets a bunch of Bitcoin that couldn't go to miners in the block for whatever reason. There are a few reasons why it sometimes happens. We can make that a CTV encumbered address that only allows us to pay out the miners if and when the time comes that they get above the threshold or for whatever reason it becomes appropriate. At that point, that breaks one of the areas of reliance people must act, the one of the areas in which people must trust Ocean is not a particularly egregious violation or expectation, rather, for Ocean to operate the way it does, because we start from the top down, which means every block we find, 90% of the contents are in miners' pockets the minute the block gets found, which is great. Sometimes 100%. It depends on the block, and it depends on the specific machine that finds it, and it depends on how the miner is working and all that stuff. But give or take, almost all of the money in any block Ocean finds, the minute it exists, the miners have it, which is great. But CTV could make that even better, and that would be nice. But again, it's a nice to have. It's not going to save the universe and stop Bitcoin from becoming a CBDC. That's not. It's one of many tools that might help us a little bit in that fight, and that is a very worthwhile fight. But it's not. It's not the solution that anyone might present it to you as being. Other features of CTV, channel factories, where you can open multiple channels in a single UTXO. These are not to be underestimated either. That's great, because that's how one of these stupid big blocker critiques of Lightning has been, everyone on Earth wants to open one Lightning channel. The blockchain literally couldn't support that. Well, channel factories definitely help with that, because you can open multiple channels in a single UTXO. How much you lessen the overall footprint in a blockchain compared to just adding each channel in its own UTXO, I don't know, but I imagine it is strictly more efficient. I don't know if there's an asymptote there, but it should be strictly better. I don't know the maths there, and I don't know if anyone's done a calculation to that effect, but I'm pretty confident that channel factories mean you can onboard a lot more people to Lightning without the proportional blockchain footprint that it would entail today, without being able to use channel factories to do it. Valid point. Again, does anyone use Lightning in a sovereign capacity today when it's really cheap to open and close a Lightning channel? Pretty much no one does. So again, not a technological barrier and not a financial limitation that would be mitigated by adding covenants. It's literally due to the fact that people don't have the will to do it. Then you have non-interactive Lightning network channels, where you can open channels without needing to interact, and you can open and close them entirely unilaterally, as far as I can tell. And I don't really understand. I mean, decreasing interactivity in Lightning is always good, but that one doesn't really seem like that much of a big deal to me. But again, it's strictly better, so let's go. That sounds like fun. And so these are some of the benefits for it. Some of the here are the cooler things that CTV isn't capable of doing by itself, and this is like a check against CTV and a check in favor of it, because in the sense that it's against, people aren't getting excited about it because it just doesn't quite do what people really want it to do. Opvolt people are like, oh, it doesn't quite do that. Lightning Symmetry people are like, oh, it doesn't quite do that. Arc people are like, oh, it doesn't quite do that. And all of those things are like the real cool, sexy tech that people are like, yeah, okay, we need CTV and this, or we need CTV and that, or we just need to do Opvolt, or we just need to do APO. And none of those other things have anything like the consensus that CTV does. Now, people might be like, CTV doesn't have consensus, but it's closer than anything else that I know. And the check in favor of it not doing any of that stuff is that it speaks to how limited in scope it is, and thus how much we can reason about the potential side effects from it. Does check lock time verify solve the heat death of the universe? No, that's kind of why it was possible to add it and why it wasn't so contentious. So that's a point in favor of adding CTV, as well as it is a point against people being able to really rally behind it as being so amazing, because it doesn't do all that much by itself. I just think it's a good place to start, because there are people that advocate for adding a combo of opcodes in order to enable some of the other things I mentioned. So I'm going to mention those. I'm going to go into what those other things are now. So that's channel factory. Sorry, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Lightning Symmetry, right? And right now you have this unscalable thing in Lightning that kind of got mitigated by splicing, which is a thing now. But let's pretend that isn't the case. In order for Lightning to work, you have to keep all of the old states of the channel in order to be able to, correctly deal with the scenario in which your counterparty is trying to close a channel in a state where they have more money than a more recent state. And that's theft, basically, and you need to be able to punish them for that, and that's the justice transaction mechanism inside Lightning, and it requires storing an ever-growing database of prior channel states. The initial Lightning Symmetry was the solution for that, where you can use any previous output when closing the channel, and thus you only needed the latest state. You didn't need all the older states. And this made Lightning just fundamentally scale much better, and Lightning devs love it. The only person I know that's against changing to that from the current justice mechanism is Evan Kaludis, who makes the Zeus Lightning wallet, which is my favorite Lightning wallet. So I'll definitely tip my hat to that, even if I don't understand why he has that perspective. So Lightning Symmetry is cool, but it's enabled by APO, which has like 6 SIG hashing modes, and only one of them is useful in that scenario, and the other 5 are weird, and no one really wants them for anything. No one's been able to think of a use. It seems like a weird way to do it, but it was the direct way to do it at the same time, whereas CTV could give us LN Symmetry, but it requires adding another opcode too, I believe, which is check SIG from stack, which certainly doesn't have consensus. Again, that's one of the ones that Adam Back is in favor of, but it's more adventurous than most people can really handle. So that's not happening for a while, and that means CTV, great, but it doesn't give us symmetry, which robs us of so much enthusiasm for it. Again, means CTV is limited in scope, so we know more about what it might do, which is great, and it removes uncertainty and risk, but at the same time, it means people aren't as enthusiastic about it, which means it's impossible to get it over the finish line. More about the finish line in Act 3. So, LN Symmetry, if we want it, another approach that's been taken to that and cherry picking the bits out of APO that we want is Reardon Code or Brandon's proposal LN Enhance, which is a combo of CTV and 3 other opcodes. Some of and I will be straight up, I do not understand the implications of adding those 3 other opcodes, but it gives us LN Symmetry, and it does some other things as well that I don't really understand, as far as I know, when it comes to, and this is desirable for making Lightning better, hence the name LN Enhance. That's not happening either because it's too much. No one is going to simultaneously add 4 soft forks. You're insane if you think that's even remotely possible in the current environment. Adding 1 soft fork is going to be controversial and difficult enough, but it's a good place to start, and it's one of the 3 things he wants. There was also a modified version of CTV with some extra, I believe, annexed data in it that Jeremy Rubin proposed that would give us LN Symmetry. With just CTV, but no one liked that modified version of CTV for some reason. I don't really know why, but that one isn't happening either. So CTV as it stands, as it has near consensus, doesn't give us LN Symmetry. And then you have some other things floating around, like Drive Chain, which I already mentioned. That's never happening. Cat certainly cannot happen. It might happen if it sort of disappears and comes back with some different people pushing for it with some new ideas around why it might be a good idea. But currently, Polstra's endorsement from Blockstream is the only thing that's not that suspicious, whilst all of the other people pushing for it are just straight up self-confessed bad actors. So that torpedoes that upgrade to the point where I'm like, hey, this is a good psyop. If there's an upgrade that could really help Bitcoin, get the Taproot wizards to present it, because then it will never happen. So, I mean, but I'm not trying to make this video start talking about stuff like that. So I've gone over the features of it. I've gone over why I like it, because I think it's minimal in scope. I think it's been around for ages now, and no one's been able to come up with anything against it that makes me go, yeah, we don't want to add this. I understand fundamentally what it does, which is this new address type, in which you can encumber your coins with certain spending conditions. I can see that we've done things like that in Bitcoin before, and it didn't break anything. Check lock time verify broke absolutely nothing, and multisig broke absolutely nothing. These are harmless upgrades, and check lock time verify is exactly the same thing in principle. It's just restricting where the coins can go address-wise and how much can be spent. I don't know the overlap exactly. Again, not an expert, but here's what I've been able to glean, right? So to me, I'm just like, that's okay. And then Luke also makes some interesting arguments for advocating for it when he talks about flexing the muscles of change, right? Because stuff can break in Bitcoin and it just becomes fatal, but Bitcoin's too important. And this is the point I've been making about mining centralization and other things of, other weaknesses inside Bitcoin, where it's like, if it's centralized, or if Bitmain are too dominant, or if there's only two mining pools, or if all the mining pools are regulated in KYC, or if there's only one implementation and there's a bunch of malicious actors working for it, or anything that can go wrong in Bitcoin of that nature, the cold truth of it is now, no one's going to sell when the ramifications of those things rear their ugly head. I'm not. If Foundry start going full, OFAC compliant and they're censoring transactions based off of a government blacklist, which is what censorship actually is, by the way, then am I going to sell my Bitcoin? No, because there's nothing else anything like as good. And this is ultimately where you get to with Bitcoin. You get to this like, is this thing going to work? Then you get to this, wow, it works and it's perfect and it's going to fix everything. And I'm sorry, eventually you get to this, it's not that, you reach this like blockchain hype area, then you get this trough of disillusionment, then you get the enlightened core developer, thing that's supposed to mean so much, where you've been around for over 10 years and you're an OG and all that. And I'm no developer, but I still know a lot about the space. And I've gotten to this point now where I'm like in stage 4, where I'm looking at it and going, there are bodies all over the place now with Bitcoin. There's so much broken stuff lying around and skeletons in the closet, but everything else is just so much worse that I think I just have to keep my money on this horse. And that is basically where my mind has been at for like the last couple of years. I've just been looking at the whole ecosystem and going, this is really just broken at this point. But am I going to sell my Bitcoin for dollars? No. Any other fiat? No. Gold? No. Am I going to gamble with it? No. Am I going to put it in the stock market, which is just gambling, in another capacity? No. Is there another crypto? No. Is there any precious metal? No. Is there real estate? No. Like, can I just own and run a business with any sort of certainty? No. I'll get rugged by the Canadian government. Like, there's nothing you can do with it. So it just, like, you can spend it on wonderful experiences and things like that, but everything is just a gamble, right? And you start getting into this whole area of like, I'm going to buy a bunch of diverse things and try and make it so that, 3 of them failed, but 6 of them didn't fail, and I can live off this, and that just about works. That seems to be where like life is heading. But all that, is why am I even off on this ridiculous tangent? I forget. Back to the point being made for like flexing the muscles of changing Bitcoin when it's necessary. Those do need to be flexed, because at this point, if Bitcoin is just breaks, the willingness to fix it and not just carry on like nothing is broken is rapidly decreasing. So once upon a time, if Bitcoin was broken and there were only a few thousand people in the community, it would be fixed. But now when things are broken, there's hesitancy. People are like, it still kind of works and the price didn't go down, so can you just leave it alone in case your fix actually breaks something and really messes with my perfect money? So that's been the situation in mining, right? People have this nonsense cope where they're like, oh, if a mining pool does a bad thing, everyone will just go to a new pool. I'm like, they're all the same pool at this point. And no, you won't. The miners are not cypherpunks. They're not going to move from a censoring OFAC compliant North American mining pool that complies with billions of lines of legislation on the miners' behalf, and the miners are all publicly traded and going to get sued by their shareholders if they do anything that goes against the regulatory environment. They're not going to move to some cypherpunk pool because of OFAC compliance. They're probably going to like it, and the price is probably going to go up when this stuff happens. So, like, I've made that point over and over again, and I'm just saying, that's an important thing to realize. So when it comes time to change stuff, it's important for us to show agility, because stuff can and will go wrong in Bitcoin, whether we change anything or not. Bugs will be found, and we know there are things that need to be fixed, and agility is necessary. So if we can demonstrate and flex the muscles, as Luke put it, of changing, then that keeps everyone on their toes, and that's not a bad thing to do. Though I agree that it's not without risk. Like, we are moving the foundation again, and moving the foundation can demonstrate to someone that's like, erecting a giant laser beam that's taking them 10 years to build and point it at your building. If you can demonstrate, hey, we can just move this house, then they go, oh, well, then there's no point building this 10-year project of this laser beam that we're going to aim to burn this house to the ground, because they can just move it. So, it is important to demonstrate agility against would-be attackers. That's a valid point. And, his perspective as a CTV seems fairly valid. So it seems fairly close to consensus and pretty harmless. And as I said, it can help Ocean, though it's limited in how much it can help us at the moment now that we have Lightning activated. And, so I don't want people to think I'm corrupting my motive there and for it to be a thing that helps Ocean and to hell with the rest of the health of the network. Like, Ocean is intimately tied to the success of Bitcoin. It doesn't have a bunch of, go on any other mining pool's website, F2Pool or Antpool, and it's all just shit coins and AI and blockchain tech and all this stuff. It's not as important, right? But Ocean is just Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin has a bad day, Ocean has a bad day. So it should all be fairly congruent when it comes to, incentives. So anyway, with all that, let's move on to Act 3 of this horrifically long video, and I'll talk about activation, because here's the thing. We have some alignment. I mentioned the complete out of alignment or lack of alignment between the monetary maximalists and the sandwich heads pushing for CTV. The sandwich avatar comes from the fact that, Jeremy Rubin is, that Rubin is a kind of sandwich, so that's where that meme came from. So yeah, apparent disappointment aside, when it came to, the assertion from Grubels that these people do not care about making it easy for people to use Bitcoin permissionlessly as a medium of exchange, because they're mocking any attempt to mitigate spam, which is clogging up the blockchain and making transactions more expensive. And it basically ruined the blockchain for like all of 2023 and some of 2024. And now it's just really annoying to sync a node. So that element of sovereignty has been undermined. It was annoying to transact permissionlessly, or at least, as cheaply as you might have done if you were only competing for block space with other monetary users. So that was undermined too. And it was reasonable to mitigate it, and these people were against it. But I've already gone over this in the second part of this video. The point is that there should have been an alignment there, and there just wasn't. Based probably on that, on the fact that it wasn't a particularly sincere concern for people that that they might make Bitcoin more usable more readily for people with less money. But nonetheless, there is some alignment there anyway, even if people don't see it that way. I certainly do. I like the idea of increasing the economic density of every on-chain footprint, because that outcompetes with spammers. And but unfortunately, if you create something which can be increase the density that is available to spammers too, then you need it to be proportionate, and at least 50-50. If, like I said, there's 99 shitcoin developers using this new tech put into Bitcoin for every one developer that wants to build a new kind of coin pool wallet or something, then that unfortunately doesn't work. And that could be the scenario. And that is my main concern, and why I'm hesitant to go full CTV tard. I'm not prepared to do that yet, based on a concern of that nature. But I don't have the technical grounding to say that's how they're going to execute it exactly. But I do have the valid suspicion when I'm like, why are the spammers themselves pushing for a certain upgrade? Why are they doing that? It obviously makes Bitcoin more efficient for them to use for their malicious intentions, and I don't want to allow them that. But that's mainly cat, remember? And and cat is much more difficult to reason about than CTV, because CTV just does similar things to multisig and check lock time verify, right? And I hope I've established that. So anyway, the monetary maximalists and the CTV sandwich heads, they have that alignment around wanting let's take them at their word and say they want to actually make Bitcoin more accessible and cheap as a medium of exchange and as a store of value, without needing to trust third parties, right? Let's say we're aligned on that, which we should be. You also have alignment with the fact that Bitcoin Core is prohibitive to getting any upgrade in, whether it's fixing the spam filters or whether it's adding a soft fork, because they just haven't been able to do it for a very long time. And the minute it's remotely controversial, they just walk away from it. So this is deep into the weeds of activation that I'm going to go right now. So SegWit, they added SegWit to Bitcoin Core. They didn't add the activation in a way that was going to work, but they did add activation logic. And then it gave miners permission to block the upgrade, which was ridiculous. The miners took that liberty, and we had to come up with a grassroots rogue client which threatened to punish miners severely if they didn't give us the upgrade in the way that Core needed them to permit. So Core said, miners, is up to you, and then the community said, actually, no, it isn't. You'll give Core you'll make any decision you want as long as it's yes. And then Core naively will look at the blocks you're producing and say, oh, great, the miners voluntarily activated SegWit. But it didn't work that way. It was the community threatening the miners with a rejection of their blocks if they didn't fall into line and become non-recalcitrant as the employees of the network that they are, rather than bosses of the rules, which is completely ridiculous. And, I digress. But that was what happened with Core, and that set the precedent, right? Because Taproot was kind of the same thing. Taproot, they basically valiantly learnt their lesson and did exactly the same mistake again, ignoring the activation client that Luke and I and Shinobi released, which had forcing logic in it, which said, miners, this is not up to you. You can activate Taproot now or later, but you're activating it one way or the other. It's going to activate one way or the other. You have the option of doing it sooner. And then Speedy Trial came out in Core in parallel, which said, don't worry if you don't want to activate it. We're not gonna hold your feet to the fire, but here are some options. And all the parameters matched the Taproot activation client that we released. And then, a couple of weeks later, the miners all just activated Taproot. And, we all sang Kumbaya together and we fixed Bitcoin. And that was the end of that. But again, it was just Core's approach to doing it, which really annoyed everyone because no one wanted another lot false activated soft fork. No one wanted to put the miners in a position again where it was up to them whether we had Taproot or not. We did it and they gave it to us, but it still wasn't appropriate. And no one in the community liked this. It was just Core decided to do it. There wasn't a single person I know that I follow in the Bitcoin community that was like, oh, cool, another, feckless approach to adding an upgrade to Bitcoin that the miners can play politics with again. Everyone was infuriated by it because it was exactly the same mistake Core made when activating SegWit. And we couldn't believe that they were doing it again. And they did, but they did it after the Taproot activation client was released. And Luke will tell you that it was our client that activated Taproot. And I don't like to disagree with Luke, but I don't share that perspective. I think that we forced Core's hand into stopping bike shedding and finally releasing their own activation parameters. And the combination of the two, and I don't know, I fought with Matt Corallo about this a lot at the time, and I was, he had a whole revisionist history of what went on with BIP 148 with SegWit activation and all that, and I really just Matt Corallo's quite an exceptional guy, and he's done some great things. And sometimes I just really feel like he has a weird agenda that I'm like, I don't get why you're pushing that narrative. Maybe there's some 5D chess going on, but I'll refrain from commenting further on that. I definitely disagreed with him around Taproot activation, and I think he was being a revisionist when it came to SegWit activation. But nonetheless, that was Taproot activation. Core basically couldn't figure out how to do it until we forced their hand, and then they did what no one wanted, which is ridiculous. CTV is way worse than that because CTV doesn't exist in Core. So what happens if there's a rogue client like Moonsettler and the other people in the L-Enhance group, which remember is CTV plus 3 other opcodes? What those people are trying to do is build an activation client that activates a soft fork that pertains to logic that only exists inside that rogue client. This is the thing. SegWit existed inside Bitcoin Core. It just wouldn't have activated. We came along and activated it, but once it was activated, the rules were enforced by every Bitcoin Core node that was, relatively recent, because the SegWit code had been getting merged for years before the activation stuff came around. Same with Taproot. Taproot code started getting merged in like 2018 or something. And then eventually in 2021, it's when it becomes active. But here's the thing. Anyone can activate it with any sort of forcing grassroots client that isn't one of the mainstream implementations. But what are you activating? Here's the thing. Once we activated SegWit, the rules were enforced by everyone on the network except really old nodes. But if we activate CTV with a parallel client, here's the thing. If you make a CTV encumbered, UTXO, and you break the spending conditions of it, a miner that doesn't care about CTV can put that in a block, and it's an invalid block from the perspective of CTV enforcing nodes, which might just be this tiny minority because CTV doesn't exist and it's not being enforced post-activation by the core nodes because they don't know what it is. So they just see a bunch of gobbledygook, but a valid transaction nonetheless. Same as now, if an ancient node is looking at a SegWit transaction, that just looks like the coins are encumbered in a script that anyone can resolve, basically. That script is trivially spendable. And this was the Craig Wright FUD against SegWit. He's like, anyone can spend a SegWit addresses are addresses from which anyone can spend, because there's a condition that is not being enforced by nodes that don't enforce the SegWit rule set. The same is true of what would happen, in CTV land. If a miner was to mine a transaction in a block that spent coins that CTV says can't be spent that way, then you have a fork, because all of the core nodes will accept that as a valid block because they don't care about those rules or whether they're enforced or not. They don't understand them. Whereas the CTV nodes are going to say that's an invalid block, and then you have a fork. Now, here's the thing. That will need to be reconciled really quickly. That will be dangerous, and no one will tolerate that. So, but that assumes it hits a certain threshold of adoption of these rogue clients. Right now, if Moon Settler and the Sandwich Heads want to start activating CTV on their own, with them and a couple of other people, maybe they get some monitoring maximalists. I don't think they'll get anywhere with it. I don't think that will be enough to make Core uncomfortable enough to go, we need to merge CTV so that we become not SPV nodes again, looking at transactions that are spent for reasons we can't fathom. They would merge it past a certain threshold. But I don't think the Sandwich Heads can reach that on their own. And this is where I talk about kind of what I'm proposing. And I can't believe it's taken me this long to get to it, but this is kind of what I think happens in Bitcoin over the next year or so, is that Luke, who has basically to his mind, CTV is pretty close to consensus, and I agree. I don't really think there's much left to talk about when it comes to what CTV does and doesn't do. I've already explained why I think it's at worst harmless, and I think he is a monitoring maximalist, and most of us have a shared dislike of Core, and that is shared by the people trying to activate CTV. They're furious with Core because they think the monitoring maximalists think Core is asleep at the wheel or malicious for not updating the spam filters and just leaving them in this completely broken state. And the CTV people and the Covenants people are furious with Core because they just won't budge on it. They don't seem motivated or interested in it. And so it's come time. I mean, Core was always going to be an issue. And I basically gave up on Core around Taproot activation for doing what I believe was just a complete violation of consensus in the community, which was we don't use lot false again, lock in on timeout. It cannot be that upgrades we all want and are in process of happening on the network don't happen because miners decided to play politics and not give it to us. That breaks Bitcoin. It almost killed us in 2017, and it could have almost killed us again in 2021. And the fact that Core would just do that so recklessly in disregard for history is not good enough. Even if Even if I think it kind of works as a status quo, which is just weird. Like I think if they merged CTV and then they brought out some feckless activation approach for it again, and then a grassroots client again came along and forced activation, I would be all right with that for Bitcoin's sake, even if I think it bodes badly for Bitcoin Core. And the spam filtration thing, though, is where my disillusionment with Core turns into downright feelings of having been betrayed. And that's basically where the CTV people are at as well. So I'm like, look, if you're not happy with Core because you think they're asleep at the wheel for different reasons to us, and you're not happy with Bitcoin overall because you think it's losing its moneyness, welcome to the monetary maximalist side. We've been unhappy with Core for the same two reasons. And, by virtue of that, we're all migrating to knots. And here's the other factor. SegWit wouldn't have activated if Luke hadn't gotten behind BIP 148. The minute he did, that was the watershed moment in the fork wars where it was suddenly like, oh, we've gone from being a chaos fringe movement that's never going to activate this thing to it actually probably is going to work here. And it did. So it was a Luke activated soft fork. And someone's going to, want to throw tomatoes at me for saying that. But it's true. It's true. Like, we needed that support. So here's the thing with CTV. If we have a genuine core developer, which is Luke, saying, all right, I think this thing has consensus, and if you guys just aren't going to activate it and you don't have a good reason for doing it, it's time for someone else to take the reins and just go for it. So I think you might, looking at what I see happening over the next year or two, is probably CTV activation going from really annoyed young sort of noobs that are trying to push this stuff on us that the community just doesn't seem to be interested in doing, to being something that actually is probably going to happen. And I think it basically is contingent on Luke's support, because other things have been, though granted this is a much steeper climb to ascend than SegWit or Taproot, because like I said, SegWit and Taproot existed inside Core. We were activating stuff they already have a stamp of approval on. It was just activation drama. Now we don't even know if we want this thing, and it doesn't exist to us yet. So I think this is going to be a bit weird. I think if they did it without the support of Luke or any other core dev, with just a pure rogue activation client rather than something that's kind of worked into knots, then I think they would just trigger a URSF, which is where the immune response happens in Bitcoin, and we say, go away with your soft fork, you're not adding this, we're going to make it incompatible. And then you prevent hostile soft forks from happening. I think that would be a tragedy if that happens with CTV, because CTV is not bad. And once you have a URSF, you have precedent for that, and then you basically never get a soft fork into Bitcoin again, because there will always be URSFs. So we don't want to trigger the first one of those. And if we do trigger it, it would hopefully be with something that we actually have a reason to hate, rather than CTV, which is just, again, I'm not taking away from all these great reasons that Giacomo has, which is mainly about Cat, or Grubels has, which is about the supposed motivations of the people pushing for, sovereign usage, or the objections of Jimmy Song, which is about stop moving the foundations around because you rug pull everyone that's trying to build the cool tools in quiet with low time preference and come up with solutions for what we have today, rather than keep messing around with Bitcoin itself to try and give us these things in a more crude way. And all of those, like I said, I consider valid arguments. I also consider the valid argument that monetary maximalists are saying, we can't wipe our own ass. Why are we adding a bunch of tech? Why are we adding 4 opcodes to perfect money when we can't even fix, the obvious problems we have hanging in front of our face right now? And why are all the people pushing for this thing bad actors? Again, similar to Giacomo's argument, but he's mainly talking about Cat. The monetary maximalists are actually talking about covenants in general. And there's one more argument the monetary maximalists made, and I forget it now. But I just want to reiterate all that, just so I can cover my own ass here, because I'm not massively in favor of CTV, but there's a political landscape here and I'm looking at it kind of opportunistically and saying, we might be able to move forward here and deal with this final boss, which is Bitcoin Core, which is always gonna be a problem. It's been a problem. It's becoming a worse problem. And, it just seems to be like turning into this nonsense project. Like this, the irony of it was just Gloria adding this new mempool stuff, truck, which is basically spam filtration, where you promise, to only spend Bitcoin transactions or include them in a block, if they come as part of a, a predetermined cluster of transactions, and you can trivially break that. This is, again, it's like they've essentially tried to implement spam filtration and use it to the effect of, trying to dictate what ends up in blocks, and use this awful heuristic of, everyone will have basically the same mempool policy, which is exact opposite of what you want. You don't want everyone to, because there's this idea, there's the mempool. I almost made a video on the mempool because it's the worst. If there was such a thing as the mempool, then you wouldn't need a blockchain. Anyone that talks about the mempool is either not understood why the blockchain exists in the first place, or it's just indicative of the fact that Bitcoin is just homogenous in a way where it needs to be diverse. And this is real diversity I'm talking about. Blocks need to be weird. You need to not know what's coming in the next block. And your fee estimation should be what has happened in the blockchain, not based on, we all have exactly the same mempool, so I know exactly what fee I need to pay to get into the next block. That just implies that everyone has exactly the same mempool policies, and that we can expect a homogeneous image of what the unconfirmed transactions on the network look like. You shouldn't look at it that way. That just implies complete capture and, centrally dictated mempool policy, which is what Bitcoin Core does. And then they pretend they don't when we ask them to fix the spam filters, where they pretend we're decentralized and that, when all of these things are just set, these are default values. And we're trying to make all this stuff tweakable, which is what Knots does. And Knot says, this is up to you to set. And Luke barely wants to have any default values at all, because it takes away from the fact that users would look at it and, decide for themselves what goes in their mempool. And it's hugely important, and everyone undermined this. I'm going off on a spam tangent again, but it was really depressing to see that undermining of the importance of choosing what you relay around the network. It's Second Amendment vibes. Like, yeah, you can't stand up against a nuclear bomb, but the fact that every single one of you is armed means that you live with freedoms that other people can only dream of. And that's just, if you have the freedom to choose what you relay around the network, that ultimately that affects what goes in blocks. And everyone's saying it doesn't matter if you have 82 bytes instead of 83 bytes op return, you're still going to see 83 bytes in blocks. You didn't make any difference. I'm like, that's such a disempowering and untrue thing. People need to take the power they have and use it to the maximum extent they can, otherwise they lose it. And it's not lost. Blocks reflect default mempool policies as well as consensus. It's not just consensus. And people trying to undermine what happens with the importance of those mempool policies, and then go further with coming up with cluster mempool, which relies on there being, an assumption around centralized, homogeneity of mempool policy, and then to pretend it doesn't exist when you can use it for spam mitigation. It's doublethink at its finest. So these are the things that's driving me nuts about Core. So Core then, it needs to be rooted around, and we're seeing a lot of Knots adoption. There's over 1,000 Knots nodes on the network now that we've picked up on, which is good because it was like 500 a year ago. So it's doubled, and the amount of Core nodes has not doubled. So we're doing well there. A lot of those nodes are probably on Start9s and Umbrels, and a lot of those are going to be Tor only. So the stats we're looking at probably didn't even pick up on them. There might be 2,000 Knots nodes rather than one. And every day I'm getting people tweeting at me and messaging me, I'm finally running a node. Or everyone that buys an Umbrel Start9 now is like, yeah, I'm running a node finally. And of course I'm doing it right. And there's a picture of the Knots logo instead of the Core logo. So great. Back to activation. I'm thinking what I would expect to happen here in Bitcoin is for CTV actually to finally start getting the traction it needs if Luke gets behind it. And at that point, it becomes something where, okay, this is either going to trigger an immune response, which I hope doesn't happen because for the reasons I mentioned, or it just means it gets activated. But at that point, I don't know what happens with core because core have to merge it in order for them to be actually a full node anymore, or they have to pretend it doesn't exist, which is just not going to be a viable option if it gets the weight of a tenured developer like Luke behind it, or or they just have to accept like second class status, which is just we are an SPV thing now. There's a bunch of half the network is doing CTV transactions, or maybe 2 or 3% of the network's doing CTV transactions, and to us they just look like a spending condition that we don't care about. So anyone can spend from a CTV. All the blocks comply with it. They don't mind invalid CTV, but if they did, we would accept their block, and they just don't happen. That to me is too dangerous. I don't think core can sustain that because it means you can have forks. You can fork off all the core nodes, or you can fork off the CTV nodes depending on which side you would categorize as being forked in that sense. And you'd want reconciliation. Forks would tank the price, and you don't want that. You don't want that kind of uncertainty in Bitcoin. No one's going to appreciate that. So the most interesting and juicy part of all this is what I've gotten to at the end here, and unfortunately, it's late in the day. I'm very tired, and I'm having a hard time really laying out exactly what I think is the vision for the next couple of years. But I basically think this is it for CTV, and if this doesn't get in, that's it for soft forks altogether. And I don't think anything else has anything like as much agreement as CTV does. So I think it's probably going to make its way in now, and I don't think it's via core. So I think the ramifications of that, the implementation everyone relies on, changing from core is enormous, while CTV itself is not really that much of a big deal. And that's kind of appropriate, because if the soft fork itself was a big deal and everyone was changing, implementation at the same time, this is just too turbulent, and that's just a hectic, chaotic environment. I don't really want to deal with that level of stress. So again, like the lack of amazing fireworks level features that CTV offers is again something I like about it rather than something I don't. It's a very reasonable upgrade, and it does a very limited amount of stuff. And getting it activated is frankly highlighting an insufficiency in the community, which is core, and routing around them is appropriate for many reasons that I've been highlighting for a while. So yeah, all that said, I think Luke has been talking about it lately, saying, look, it looks like he has consensus. There's internal discussions going on between, private room discussions where people are going, all right, maybe, and, people are shaking hands and stuff like that. All sounds very shady and dark, right? But that is, kind of how things just work, right? Not everything people want to discuss and get ripped to pieces in public for it. I'm not privy to these conversations, by the way. Everything I know pretty much ends up on YouTube or Twitter, so I'm pretty candid with you all. I just see that as being a good thing. And I think if we end up with CTV, 18 months from now, and it activated in a way that made people just sort of generally step away from core, I think that breaks the most centralized and dangerous part of the whole ecosystem, which is just everyone uses Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core can act like assholes, and no one moves. So to me, that's an accident waiting to happen. So if CTV is the catalyst for moving everyone away from it because of Core's own inertia, then that would have been a very happy thing for me. And I don't think anyone really loses out of that. Though obviously it's turbulent, and obviously I can't pretend to know all the ramifications of it. There are going to be some days where I definitely miss Core, and I think Core, being in the centralized position it was in to basically dictate mempool policy that it's happy to acknowledge when it comes to Chuck or cluster mempool, that would have been really great. That would have killed spam. But somehow the spam basically died on its own anyway. There's a lot of op return spam, but op return spam was never something we had a direct beef with at Ocean. It was always the olive branch for arbitrary data storage. It didn't have the witness discount. It didn't bloat the UTXO set. It didn't attack fungibility. All of those things meant I don't really care about this kind of spam. And the transaction fees are still really cheap anyway, so I'm not really that bothered about it. It's still annoying for syncing a node, but like I said, it doesn't bloat the UTXO set, so it's not that much worse. Yeah, so that's basically where I'm at. I think that's going to happen with Bitcoin. If this video really, really rubs you up the wrong way and you're like, well, how dare you be adding this soft fork for whatever reason, I'm open to that. Tell me why. Like, I genuinely want to hear it at this point, but I've been dealing with this, wrestling with this for years now, trying to figure out the right way forward in all this. And it's something that I don't think... It's like I said at the beginning, this is like this convoluted left-wing meme that doesn't have a punchline because it's just so much context and theory that you have to accept and nonsense that you kind of have to understand before you come to any conclusion, that it doesn't have any weight. This is not a 5-minute video where I'm like, we need this upgrade and it does that. And everyone's like, yeah, I can get behind that. It's just not that kind of situation. Like, we have a situation where Bitcoin's just kind of not working very well because of stagnancy and inertia and laziness and complacency on part of just everyone in the community. And this is basically a good way to break all that for no real good reason. It just kind of fixes everything in a way that you could never explain without all the context I just gave in this horrific video. So I don't know anyone that shares the perspective I have here, but that's the way I see it. And that's why I think I'm going to basically say we're going to have some sort of activation client for CTV come around. Core are going to trash us again. It's not my first time where I've been trashed by Core. And it's going to affect the way Bitcoin looks. And it's probably going to be a good thing. And in this case, it's going to do a lot less than the Taproot activation I was so gung-ho about pushing for that, well, it was mainly SegWit that's responsible for the spam, not Taproot. But nonetheless, yeah, Taproot was, there are unintended consequences as a result of upgrades I've been vigilantly pushing for before. I'm not really worried about that with CTV because I just don't think it does enough to permit any of that stuff. But it still forces it breaks the log jam. And that being the case, we can get Bitcoin back into a healthier place. I definitely think we've earned some goodwill with what we've done with Ocean. Now we have a bunch of miners making their own blocks. We really did meaningfully come up with the correct tech and did what we needed to get adoption of it. In under a year, we've broken up the notion that there's a few mining pools and they decide what goes in the chain, and that's just Bitcoin now. We really did break that. And Ocean's like still less than 1% of the network hash rate, way less than 1%. And we've demonstrably shown that actually miners can make their own templates and they're happy to do it. And it's a realistic way to run a pool. And it means that if a pool becomes huge like Antpool or Foundry, the fact is we know now that the miners can be responsible for what goes in the chain, not the pool. And that means that Bitcoin is just way more censorship resilient. There are thousands of miners on Foundry. They could all be making templates using Datum now. We've demonstrated that. So if someone wants to come and enact a censorship attack on Bitcoin via a big pool, we've demonstrated that there's a way to route around that now. And that's been really good. And I think Luke has built up a lot of goodwill over the years for doing so many good things for Bitcoin. And I'm just about keeping my head above water with it too. And I think our advocacy of CTV should mean something to people. I'll be the first to admit I don't understand it. I don't understand it to the depths required to be a massive champion of it. But I do understand a lot of the surrounding circumstances. And I think it's appropriate to try and activate it now, even with my limited understanding. And a lot of that comes from just trust and discussions with people that I do think understand Bitcoin, understand the ramifications of it a lot more deeply than me. And I've been waiting for them to come up with some sort of reason against it, and they just haven't, because it doesn't exist. And that doesn't mean they haven't studied it. It just means usually if they're not a champion of it, it just means they have some other, more featureful fork they want to do, like in Adam Back's case, simplicity or drive chain or things like that. And you're like, Well, okay, but that doesn't mean CTV is bad. It just means CTV doesn't do enough. And I'm all right with it not doing enough because that's not going to hurt. So yeah, I'll end it there. Um, I cannot for a minute believe anyone would watch this entire video, but probably someone is going to. But what I really want to stress here is you can just get at me and tell me, look, you're missing something. And because look, if I go anti CTV, like it's going to have a little bit of clout at this point. And this is amazing that I've reached this status in the Bitcoin world where my endorsement or rejection of things is actually relevant to something, but it actually does have a bit of pull now. And I want to use that responsibly. So if I've missed something, I really do want to know here. But like try as I might, I haven't been able to uncover any more than I've laid out in this video. There's doubtless some context I've missed, but I've done my best. And I definitely want to keep the conversation going because I think activating CTV at this point does a lot of good, and I don't really see the harm it does. Unless it triggers a URSF, and I don't think it will do that if Luke's behind it. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to end it there. Thanks so much for watching, and yeah, be a part of this conversation. And yeah, thanks for watching.